collection of stories where all the women are over 50. Publishers are like, I said, but women over 50 are the people who read books, right? No, we can't do that. I'm interested in, this was not on my list of questions, but I want to come back to what you said about not knowing you were writing a novel. You were writing stories, and then you began to realize they were chapters. How did that happen? Because that's always interesting to people to find out.
I thought I was writing linked stories, and the first story began in your class at Ohio State.
Another stop on our
Michelle
tour.
dared me to write a new story because I kept bringing stories I was revising to class. She's like, I dare you to write a new story. I was like, I better grab that dare and go with it. So I did. And that was Rainie's story, or chapter in the novel. It was the first one, which is not the first chapter in the novel. And then came Lulu, and then came Saul. And I thought there were linked stories. And my advisor in grad school, I did finally get into grad school. I was almost 50. And my advisor, who's much younger than me, said, do you realize that you're writing a novel? In fact, you're writing 2 novels, or maybe you're writing 3 novels because you have all these linked stories that aren't really linked stories. They're chapters. So I went with the story that meant a lot to me, which was the novel Sibylla Drive.
Are the other 2 novels that your advisor pointed out going to be written? Are they on your list?
I don't know. One is in Berlin. Yeah, I don't know.
You know, I will say it's a kind of cliche of creative writing classes for people to say, this story is really a novel. I think this story is really 2 stories. In fact, when I was in graduate school, we had T-shirts made. We had Iowa Writers Workshop T-shirts made that said, this T-shirt is really 2 T-shirts. I think this T-shirt should be a novel. Nothing happens in this T-shirt. And so on, which is actually a nice segue, because I want to talk to you about Nothing Happens. Because, well, for 2 reasons. One, because I was struck by the fact that some of these, not all, but some of these stories are more almost tone poems than stories in the traditional sense of, this is the way we talk about it, the sort of boneheaded way we talk about it in creative writing classes for undergrads is a story is about how, the story is about X and how something happens to X, and then what happens to X because of the thing that happened, right? That's a very kind of dumbed down way of talking about what makes a story. And some of them are more atmospheric than about, what happens. And some of them I think are even downright like prose poems. I would say there are a couple of really strange, beautiful, strange stories. I can't even read my own handwriting. I wrote In the Great, what is that?
In the Great Wide?
In the Great Wide. And the last time I saw Mitsu. Are those, well, I have a bunch of questions about all this, but let me first ask you, do you see those as something like sort of separate? Did you write them at a different time than the others? Or are you doing all these kinds of stories at the same time? Like, do you have Picasso's Blue Period? And
there's a, well, I could tell you about, let me tell you about a different story and then I'll go back to those. So Gorilla is one of the first stories that I wrote, which is a complicated story because it's about a woman who's in an abusive marriage. And yeah, you have to tread carefully with a heavy subject like that. And I started writing it and I wrote almost the entire thing. So weird. In front of the old Crestview Co-op, which is now Flux and Flow.
Where I dance every day.
Yeah, where I take yoga on the corner of Calumet and Crestview in Clintonville. And I sat outside and wrote probably 5 of the 10 pages really fast before I went into the store to buy eggs.
Why?
I was buying.
Well, I mean, why did you write there?
And
why didn't you come over and sit on my porch?
This is true. You were right there. I just wanted to get the words down.
Hmm.
And I had been to a poetry reading, and it was Henri Cole, say no more.
Mhm.
And he read a poem about a gorilla that saw in, or the persona saw in the Berlin Zoo. And I knew that I had seen that same gorilla, and I needed to write something
Hmm.
down about it, and it became
Hmm.
the story. So that's the origin of one of the stories, and how fast it happened.
Yeah.
And of course it took a lot of revisions to get the real story down. And I still have mixed feelings about that story.
I do
But
too.
but
But
Miss Sue,
it's the darkest story in the book by far. But in some ways, it's also the most story-ish of the stories, you know. I mean, none of them, I wouldn't call any of these stories conventional, naturalistic, realistic stories. They're so, I said atmospheric already, and lyric. And then you make moves like in the biker and the girl, there are no names, you know, which immediately makes the story feel strange and as if we're in a fog of some kind. I guess what I'm curious about is how much decision making goes into these kinds of stories, or are we talking about pure instinct and inspiration? And I'll give you context. So I'm not much of a telling stories kind of story writer myself, which is probably why I was such a big fan of your work when you showed up in my class. What year was that? Do you remember? I have no idea.
I'm guessing 2006, 5, 4, 3.
Sometime in the early aughts. We keep reappearing in each other's lives in various ways. And I'm taking a short aside into my own writing. Right after I retired last spring, something very surprising happened to me while I was sitting on my porch. I had an idea for a middle grade novel, which I started writing. I thought, I got the time now. I can do whatever the hell I want. And I wrote it. I wrote a lot of it, and then I was excitedly telling my daughter about it, that same tiny little baby that I sat with in the La Leche League meeting, except now she's almost 30. She's still tiny. She's 4'10". And she said, Mama, you need to write an outline. This whole kind of meandering portraiture, philosophical stuff, that's just not going to fly with 11-year-olds. You need to have a plot. And I said, what is this plot you speak of, child? But I took her, it's pretty funny. She is very amused. I took her seriously, and I wrote an outline for the first time at age 67. I wrote an outline for a book, and it was a revelation. It was a 50-page, highly detailed outline, but I wrote a book with a plot for the first time in my life. And I haven't tried it, and I don't think I will try it on the writing I do for grownups who do have patience for this sort of thing. But I realized I have always thought that I wrote the kinds of books I write out of a kind of, like, that's the purest expression of my authentic self. You know, I don't really care about anything that happens. I only care about, for me, I care about what people think and feel in their relationships. And I would say for you, and you tell me if you agree, you care about those things, plus you care very much about place, which plays almost no role in my writing. And you care very much about imagery. There's so much, there's oyster shells here and there in the book. And as I said, lots of color and animals. And this, this is all leading to a very long lead up to a question, but I have to read this passage out loud because it was so beautiful and it did so much of the work in this story. Let's hope I really did dog ear it. I think I did. I dog eared a lot of things. Come on. Yes. Okay. So this is in the Celia story, which is,
In the first star.
thank you. Even the titles are extremely lyric. They could be titles of poems. It's just this very brief paragraph early in the story. The December evening turned in on itself, black and starry. Celia was accustomed to wide open beach skies where at night ocean and sky became one. Here in northern Florida, the stars were fringed and sometimes hidden by tall spiky pines and the earth's sudden curves. Celia wrapped her small hands inside the hem of her sweater. Now there's nothing, there are no, big metaphors in that, unlike in many other places in the book, but it's such precise descriptive writing, which is something else you rely on a lot. So the question embedded in this long thing is, are you thinking about those choices, or does this feel like this is just what happens? This is who you are as a writer, and there's not some other writer that you might be if you chose to. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
I do. Yeah, no, I do. Well, I would say in the drafting of stories, I just let the words fly, sometimes I get really lucky. Like the very first line in "We Are Here Because of a Horse," which is very much imagery. That just came. And I don't think it came at the very beginning, but it came when I knew more about the characters. And so sometimes things happen out of order, and in revision, you realize what really needs to be in the story to make it work, and what needs to leave. And in terms of the writers who are more plot driven, or the kind of writing that's more plot driven, I'm not that kind of writer at all. I'm more maybe character driven place for sure, because I want my characters to have something to stand on. I want them to be in a city or a town or on a floor that feels real. And so I think that's where all of the
I would say
imagery comes from, is like trying to set them in place.
Places, I don't know, I might even put place ahead of character for you, because places feel like, you have that one story that's set in Columbus where my notes are not very organized, but there's this, you can tell me which story it was as I look for the name of it, where you hit really hard, you name specific places, stores, restaurants, streets.
Mm-hmm.
And so for someone who lives in Columbus, it's a little bit exciting. It's like stumbling on, I don't know, some personal thing. Yeah. Which story? Oh,
the Wexner Center.
Yes, the Wexner Center is in there. Yeah, it's what is it? Skylight? Yes, Skylight was the story that's anchored with not just place but time. Places in Columbus, a specific time period in Columbus. Mostly the stories are Southern, which is why the Columbus story felt Southern or European.
That specific story was also written on a dare.
Really? Who dared you to write that one?
So one of the people who this book is in memory of, Mark Fabiano, who used to be, he was like the criminal along with me. We were reading each other's writing before anybody else was reading it. He was the first reader. And now I don't have a first reader, which is really strange, but I don't have Mark as a first reader anymore. So that's very strange. But he said, I bet you can't write a story about Ohio. You just can't do it. And he was right, because in Skylight, I failed. I don't know, maybe you think I
failed. You failed. You don't think it's a good story? You failed to write a story about Ohio.
Well, I wrote about a woman who lives in Columbus, but she doesn't really live in Columbus. She still lives in Louisiana.
Right. And the other, that's funny because I don't think it's a failed story. I think it's a good story, but I think you do fail to make it actually feel like Ohio. I wasn't going to say this, but as long as you said it, there's so many names. There's Cup of Joe and the Wexner Center. And it's like, there's all this name checking going on, but I'm glad to know that you wrote it on a dare, because this can actually be anywhere with any names. it doesn't have a, so this is interesting too, and this takes us far afield, but it's as if you haven't really lived in Columbus all these years. You've been in Columbus all these years, but you've been living in Berlin and Louisiana, right? I mean,
Yeah.
in your, yeah. And I say this with love because until 6 or 7 years ago, I didn't live in Columbus either, even though, I mean, I have only recently, unfortunately, now that I'm finally going to be going back to New York in a couple of years to live near my daughter, now I feel at home here. It took long enough, and it's going to be really hard to leave. And I realized that I've started setting things here where everything I was writing before was set in New York. It's a funny, yeah, it's a funny piece of business. I was going to ask you, I'm searching for the story because you mentioned Mark, and there's one story in here that when I started reading it, I said, oh my God, this is Lee Kay. Do you know which one I'm talking about? Sweet Iowa.
Oh.
That first sentence, the first time Howdy Miller saw Morgan Loving, she was walking across the bar room, her legs like scissors cutting up the room, slicing through the stairs that followed her. She had the kind of walk that would take her somewhere. I thought, oh my God, that's a Lee Kay Abbott story. Tell me if that story has any relationship to your studying with Lee or reading Lee, or do you think I'm crazy?
Maybe reading Lee or listening to Lee when he would, you know, slice up a story.
So Lee Abbott was a colleague of mine. So I'm the old lady of the English, the creative writing program at Ohio State, which is shocking to me because I was the kid when they hired me in 1988. And I helped hire Lee the following year. And he was did any of you know him? Does anyone in this room know Lee Kay? He was a sort of an American swashbuckling, at least apparently, well, none of it was really true, sort of macho, Marlboro man kind of guy, at least on the outside. And he had a real cult following among students, especially male students, right, who just trailed after him. And it turns out female students too, but that's another story. Some of which did not emerge until near his death. But I felt, yeah, that was the only story where I felt it, where I saw someone else's fingerprints.
It's funny because you read We Are Here Because of a Horse, the second story in the collection, and he, you know, he put big check marks next to the first line and the last line, but everything else in between, he's like, oh, it'll pass. It'll pass.
Yeah.
And so there probably was in my memory like a shadow of Lee when I wrote that, because he was still around, but we weren't working together at that point. But I'd worked with him enough in postgraduate workshops that I would know. Yeah. I knew better.
His voice was in your head. Yeah. See, when his voice ever entered my head, my response was, shut up. I loved Lee.
This book is also in memory of Lee Kay and Nancy Zafras, and so
these are writers, you know, you've known and been close to various extents. You want to talk about like the writers who've had an impact on you just through reading them? Like who are the writers, who are your touchstones?
Well, when you were talking about my style of writing, how I'm more place-centric and I'm very concentrated on language. I think that started with Eudora Welty. And specifically, there's a story called A Curtain of Green, where I don't know how she does it. I still don't know how she does it, but she dives into the story as if she's a great heron and she's diving straight down into this garden. She's way up here with point of view, and she comes way down and it gets greener and more specific, and all of a sudden you're with that main character. And I've read that story so many times and I still can't figure out how she does it, but it's so beautifully done. And that's what I strive for, is to write as powerfully as Welty, and then I could go in a totally different direction, Louise Erdrich. who also, I think these are called novels by publishers,
But they're
but she's
linked
writing
stories.
linked
Yeah.
stories.
Well, I think I don't even remember. That first book might have initially been published as linked stories. And then, I mean,
Yeah,
you should
Love
know
Medicine,
that what
maybe.
something is called often has very little to do with the writer's intentions. I mean, and usually it screws us over. My novel Dog, which is a very short novel, I asked my agent to send out as a standalone novella. Actually, I asked her to send it out along with 2 other novellas originally. And she said, no, let's just send it out by itself. And then the publisher took it and they said, we're going to call it a novel. And I said, please don't call it a novel. If you call it a novel, reviewers are going to say, this is not a novel, it's a novella. And sure enough, that's what a lot of reviewers said. Same thing with my first book of essays was billed as a memoir. And people said, this is an interesting book of essays. It's not a memoir. So I was thinking about another Southern writer. Do you read Reynolds Price? Because I saw Reynolds Price's fingerprints here too.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in a way that I love. Reynolds Price is just a beautiful writer and never met a metaphor he didn't like. And he really leans in, I think, to that kind of figurative language. The stories are steamier than yours, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Another writer who's young, and also Southern, Holly Goddard Jones.
Another former student of mine.
She's I don't know if she so much influences me, but I am just swept away by her
She's
writing.
a good writer.
Sure, it's very long stories, and when she's writing stories, and they're just, you can't stop reading them. You're like, oh my God, what's going to happen to that girl now? You have to turn the page and find out.
So the page turning thing, is that an ambition? Because you can't really write a page turner without an outline. This is what I've been. Have you ever outlined anything you've written? Or are you like me? Then I dare you. It's time right now.
No, I mean, there might be a couple in there where my hand was forced by mentors in grad school or other writers who are peers. A friend of mine, I won't name names, and I love her.
We've named so many names, though.
I think she wanted me to use outlines more, and I tried, but they all got thrown away.
I mean, as I say, I can't imagine doing it. I mean, there's a certain amount of reverse engineering you end up doing if you're writing a novel, especially. I mean, my last novel, Close Up, it's a pretty long novel, but it was twice as long when I originally sent it to my agent, and it has so many moving parts and so many storylines that I didn't write an outline, but I did write a timeline. That was after I had begun it. And the idea of sitting down and planning the beats of something and knowing where it's going to end, I don't think I would do it for anything except something that's written for children. But who knows?
Well,
I highly recommend writing for children. It was the most fun I have ever had in my life writing this book.
I tried to write a picture book once.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like that much fun.
And then, of course, you have to find the person that's the illustrator.
Yeah.
Hi, Annie. Hi, KB. I'm not the illustrator, but yeah, I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And when you're doing a picture book, there's a lot of repetition and.
Yeah, no, I would not. I mean, I honestly did not know I was writing a middle night. When I first had this idea, it was about something happening to an 11-year-old. And I thought, oh, forget about it. Who wants to read a book with an 11-year-old protagonist? It's not going to work. And then I realized, I know who would read a book with an 11-year-old protagonist. So it was fun. I was thinking we should probably transition to some questions from people here.
Sure.
If you have questions, I'll call on you. That's always fun. Yeah. Good question.
I think fiction sometimes starts with fact, and it could be just an image that you begin a piece with, or a memory. It depends. It could be, well, let's say, in Bob White, the the little girl Carly sees her cousin Robbie clean a quail. That is actually something that happened to me in childhood on a picnic outside of Picayune, Mississippi, which is where that story is set. And the boy's name was Robbie. So
the answer is yes.
Yeah. So there's certainly pieces, but in terms of who Carly is, she's not Karin. And it could start with like the first kiss, the 16-year-old in the first story who wants that first kiss. I was 15. I definitely wanted that first kiss before I turned 16. But the unnamed narrator in the geography of first kisses is not Karin. There are a lot of elements in there that could be likened, but
this actually makes me want to ask a follow-up question. Have you written, or do you have any interest in writing personal nonfiction? Telling true stories about yourself and your life?
Not at this point. I have a very interesting mother and father, and it would be wonderful to have their stories told.
Mm-hmm.
But I think at this point, I don't want to do that work.
Oh, that's interesting.
It would be very complicated. Well, with my mother, it wouldn't be so complicated. With my father, it would be more complicated.
It's interesting because I spent years, when we first started at Ohio State many years ago in the early 90s, offering creative nonfiction classes, which is now a big thing. I was so grumpy about it. I would say, if we're going to have creative nonfiction, we should have creative non-poetry. And when writers visited, and ultimately when we were hiring someone, I remember we were hiring Bill Rohrback, I was the hostile audience member saying, so why would you waste all that good material in like personal essays when you could just save it for fiction? And so when I began to write personal nonfiction in 2001, 2002, I was ashamed. I had to eat my words. And the reason I ask you this is because what I discovered when I started writing about my own life, and I have 3 published books of these stories and now another one done that I'm trying to sell. I cringed at all of the things in fiction over the years that I had used that people might now know. I mean, if I included them in my nonfiction, people would know that they were based on my life. And I was in the middle, when I published my first nonfiction book, I was in the middle of checking the galleys of a novella. And I had the chance to go back in and change some details so that they wouldn't be quite like what was in the because it was embarrassing, because that question that people ask, and people in audiences who aren't writers always want to know that. And I mean, writers want to know it too, but they don't ask because we know it's a very sensitive subject. But I've never yet given a reading or done an event with my fiction where people haven't said, so how much of this is true? And how much of this character is really like you? When you write nonfiction also, they actually know the answer.
Yeah, well, I was in a workshop with Pam Houston. She was the teacher. We were the students. And a question that she's always asked, she writes a lot of memoirs and she's written fiction. And so people ask her how much of this is fact and how much of this is fiction. And she'll say, oh, about 80, I can't remember what the number, but I'll just make a guess, 82%. Either way, however you want to do it.
That's a clever way of responding to that question. It's my spiel lately is that the fiction is truer than the nonfiction. The fiction is more factual. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Well, when I won the Acacia Fiction Prize, the press director at Kalisa Gaia Press, I asked him, do you want to keep this as the title of the collection? Which is, I mean, it won that contest with this title for the collection. And he said, oh, yes, it definitely speaks to the entire collection. There's place and movement in place. There's, I mean, the first story is all about compass points, east, south, due north, moving all over, lots and lots of direction. In The Biker and the Girl, there's complete momentum. And sometimes you wish it would stop because some of it's kind of scary. And even in the tiniest little story in here about Mitsu, there's this sort of sway and movement that speaks to place and longing, and the characters definitely want something in each of these stories. In every story, there's a character that wants something, and that's how you get the story. But in these specific stories, most of the narrators are girls or women. There are 3 stories where they're men, but the stories that they're telling are really about girls or women. And they're traveling over a lot of terrain. So between the yearning for the first kiss and the terrain that you have to travel, all of that is going on in the stories. So the geography of first kisses definitely works for the collection. I kind of did a roundabout, so I don't know if I actually answered your question, but
Ask a fiction writer a question and that's what you get. Anyone else? Yeah.
A favorite story. Oh, I don't.
Which of your children do you like?
Which of my children do I love the most? I love them all. You know, actually, I went through this so many times with the edits. We were fast tracked. Instead of the typical 18 months to publish, there were 9. And so, and I won't get into the whole InDesign formatting issues that we had, but I read these stories as a book probably 10 to 20 times aloud, definitely 10 times aloud. And so even the ones that I thought were like the ones that were hiding in the corner and didn't want really any kind of attention, they needed love too. And I loved them even more because they were trying to hide. Like, come out of there. You don't need to be hiding.
Okay.
So,
Was there another question? No? Yes.
tell you about. Oh, the inspiration was the Henri Cole poem. And I think the name of the poem is I stare at a gorilla in the Berlin Ape House or something like that. I'm sorry, Henri. It's really straightforward. It's like one of the first lines of the poem. And because of the way he went through the poem, I mean, his poem means something different to him than it meant to me. And it might mean to somebody else. But because I had spent time in the 80s before the wall came down in Berlin, and then later with my children in the 90s, I knew about this baby gorilla that by the time my kids got to Berlin was a grown-up and a silverback. And I just knew that had to be the same gorilla because I think Henri Cole was in Berlin in 88, and it was this young male gorilla that he was looking at. And I don't think a name was named. Like, gorillas have names in the zoos, but there was something about the mood of the poem and the tone where I knew I wanted to write a story in Berlin about a woman with her children looking at this gorilla in the ape house. And the fact that it turned into a completely different kind of story with abuse and also the attraction to abuse was not any, I did not know I was going there. No, I mean, and that's definitely not something that is fact.
And that
is
really,
totally fiction.
It really is the way fiction happens. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
which may be one of the reasons that, you know, neither of us have ever been outline kind of writers, because of the joys of that surprise. Joys may be the wrong word in this case, but the amazing, mysterious way you make a decision, you know, you have to make some kind of decision. I'm going to write about that gorilla and see what happens. And what happens, you never know what's going to happen.
Right.
Really.
So yeah, I followed Sandra. She took me into her life, and it was a crazy life.
Yeah. I mean, if you're, and it's, I know it sounds a little new age, you know, like I go into a trance and but if you trust what's happening, it's kind of, the way I think about it is it's like your dreams, you know, you don't control your dreams, but many of us believe that our dreams are telling us something about what we're actually thinking or feeling and aren't fully aware of. And that's what I feel like this does, you know, something opens a portal and then you follow it. And then of course you have to shape it along the way and go back and rewrite it 50 times. Honestly, even with my children's book with the outline, I was still full of surprises to me. Like you know, oh, I didn't know that this old man was gay and has been mourning his dead husband for 60 years. I had no idea until it just happened.
In the novel that I'm working on now, I literally put everything in the novel that I saw, that I heard. It was during COVID, so why not?
Yeah.
But it was also a road trip. It is a road trip. So it's just all full of crazy surprises. Yeah. And I didn't know that they were going to end up in there. I just thought, why not? And they worked.
And that's the way we do it. Lightning round. We've mentioned a bunch of stuff that kind of reappears, sort of, you know, concerns of yours. Did you happen to notice any other sort of off the top of your head things that themes or situations or scenarios that reappear in the stories?
Actually, it's funny because until recently, when I've been doing content writing and answering interview questions that I've been writing rather than speaking, I have realized, I mean, I knew already that, yeah, there are a lot of girls and women in this book, and that's definitely one of the things that connects the stories. But there are a lot of only children.
Mm-hmm.
I am an only child. I didn't even realize I was writing about only children. I knew I was writing about only children, but it didn't slam me over the head.
Okay, and besides the only children, did you notice anything else?
Besides the only children, children whose parents are absent.
Indeed,
in many different ways.
There's so many missing parents. Ding, 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 the lightning round, and she wins. It's fascinating. I mean, because and sometimes with that stuff, you don't notice it until you're promoting a book, say, or someone's interviewing you, or someone attacks you for it. You know, like I once went before a class, and it was actually one of Lee Kay's class. He invited me in, and one of the students said, "You're always writing about adultery. Have you ever done that?" And it was actually an interesting question because I hadn't realized how many of my characters are unfaithful. And I am a very faithful person. And I think for me, it's something that fascinates me. And it's kind of the other path. I mean, some of what I write is obviously from my own experience, but is this like kind of fascinating idea? So yeah, I thought, because I have a lot of missing parents in my work too. And my own parents weren't missing. So who knows why?
Yeah, my mother was very present. She still is. Hi, Mom.
All right. Anything else you want
All right.
Uh-huh. I knew this was coming.
I have to use my phone for this. I'm gonna sing to you guys because this is what's been keeping me calm for the past couple of weeks. With all the promotion and everything, just boom, boom, boom happening. I told Michelle and Whitney that I had a recurring dream about being late to this event. I had the dream 3 times and it kept getting better. So, but none of that happened. But in order
So
to
you're
keep
gonna sing
myself
Celebration?
calm, I'll just sing you one stanza and I hope Aretha forgives me. I kiss and you kiss, each kiss, sweet lips. I tease and you squeeze and we find sweet bliss. That's how we know love is the only thing that matters at all. After all, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
5 books.
Thank you, Whitney and Zach and Bexley Library and everybody for being here. And Annie in absentia. Okay. Anyway, I wanted to thank her for this. Annie was here, but this beautiful cover. Absolutely. And this is what I've been reading. This is so good. I'm going to share somebody else's book. Talia Lakshmi Kaluri, What We Fed to the Manticore. It's so gorgeous. Talks about, it has more animals and colors in it too. Thank you all so much.